90 minutes. That was all it took to undo months of planning, thousands of lives, and a confidence that had taken years to build. At the edge of the battlefield, far from the generals and maps, a junior officer sat hunched over a radio set. He wasn't famous. He wouldn't be remembered in speeches. His job was simple: listen, relay, wait. Most days, nothing happened. Static filled the hours. Silence became routine. But that morning, the silence felt different. The air carried tension, subtle, heavy. Wrong. The radio crackled more than usual, as if the wires themselves were nervous. He adjusted his headset, checked the dials, and glanced at his watch. Command had issued clear instructions: hold position until confirmation arrives. Confirmation was expected within 90 minutes. 90 minutes felt harmless, almost generous. The first message arrived quietly, fragmented, rushed, half buried in static. Enemy movement. Not confirmed. Possibly misinformation. The officer wrote it down carefully, exactly as trained. He sent it upward. The response came back quickly in cold wait. Minutes passed. The radio operator beside him tapped a pencil against the table. Outside, engines idled. Soldiers joked nervously. Confidence still lived in their voices, but it was thinning. Another transmission broke through. Clearer this time, multiple units. Direction confirmed. The junior officer felt his stomach tighten. He relayed it again, word for word. Again, the response was the same: hold. Doctrine mattered. Procedures mattered. Breaking protocol had consequences: court-martial, disgrace, the end of a career that had barely begun. The officer swallowed his doubt and obeyed. The clock moved. 30 minutes gone. Then came the message that changed everything. The signal was strong, urgent, desperate. A frontline unit was already engaged. They weren't supposed to be. Something had gone wrong: orders misread, assumptions made, timing misaligned. The battlefield was no longer theoretical. It was real, loud, and alive. The junior officer's hand hovered over the transmit button longer than it should have. This wasn't his decision to make. He sent the message. The reply took longer this time. When it came, it carried hesitation, something rare in command language. Requests for clarification. Requests for confirmation. Requests that consumed minutes the battlefield did not have. Outside, the sound changed. What had been distant became close. What had been imagined became undeniable. Smoke rose beyond the ridge. The officer felt it in his chest before he heard it. Impact, movement, chaos beginning to form. 60 minutes. Someone asked if they should prepare to move. He repeated the order: hold. The word tasted wrong. Another transmission arrived, short, raw, almost breaking apart mid-sentence. Losses reported, positions compromised. The junior officer closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them and sent the message up the chain. This time the silence after sending it was unbearable. 75 minutes. Orders finally came, but they belonged to a battlefield that no longer existed. The situation had changed faster than authority could adapt. Units moved late. Support arrived misaligned. The enemy had already taken advantage of the pause, the hesitation, the waiting. When the 90 minutes ended, the outcome was already sealed. Not by a single mistake, not by one person, but by time misunderstood, underestimated, wasted. Later reports would use clean language, delayed response, communication gaps, unforeseen variables, words that sounded controlled and reasonable. But the junior officer knew the truth. He remembered the weight of the headset, the sound of static swallowing urgency. The moment his finger hesitated, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much about doing everything right. He would replay those 90 minutes for years, not because he disobeyed orders, but because he didn't. The battlefield didn't end when the shooting slowed. For the junior officer, it began there. After the 90 minutes passed, the radio never went quiet again. Messages flooded in, too many too fast, overlapping like waves crashing without rhythm. Coordinates changed, units repositioned. Requests contradicted each other. The clean structure of command dissolved into survival. He kept transmitting. That was his job. But something inside him had shifted. Every message now carried weight, not just information, but consequence. Each pause felt dangerous. Each word felt late. He spoke clearly, precisely, exactly as trained, yet the training suddenly felt thin compared to reality. Outside the command tent, stretchers moved past without ceremony. No speeches, no announcements, just bodies wrapped in canvas and silence. Soldiers avoided eye contact as they passed the radios, as if looking too closely might assign blame. No one said anything. They didn't need to. When the firing stopped completely, the stillness felt heavier than the noise had. The officer removed his headset for the first time in hours. His ears rang not from sound, but from its absence. He noticed his hands were shaking. He told himself it was adrenaline. Later, briefings were held. Maps were updated. Lines were redrawn to explain what had already happened. Senior officers spoke calmly about lessons learned and adjustments needed. Words like inevitable and complex floated through the room. No one mentioned 90 minutes. No one mentioned hesitation. The junior officer sat at the back, notebook open, pen resting on a blank page. He wrote nothing. There was nothing to write that wasn't already burned into him. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard static. Not loud, just persistent. The kind that waits. The kind that fills space when something important should be there. He replayed moments he hadn't noticed at the time. The tightness in voices, the unfinished sentences, the way urgency sounded when trapped behind protocol. He wondered when, exactly, the battlefield had slipped beyond control. Was it the first message, the second, or the moment he chose not to push harder? The questions had no clean answers. Days later, casualty numbers were released. They came in columns and totals, abstract, distant, almost manageable. But he imagined faces behind each number, voices that had once come through his radio, steady or strained, now permanently silent. He told himself he wasn't responsible. And that was true. But it wasn't the same as feeling innocent. Time passed. The operation became a case study. Officers discussed it in classrooms, pointing to timelines and emphasizing decision-making under pressure. The 90-minute window was mentioned, but only as a concept, a variable. Never as a feeling, never as a human experience. The junior officer was reassigned, new post, new equipment, same radio, different frequency. On the surface, everything continued. Careers don't stop for reflection. Wars don't pause for guilt. But something had changed in how he listened. Now, when a voice came through uncertain, he leaned closer. When a message sounded rushed, he didn't dismiss it. When silence stretched too long, he felt it press against him, demanding attention. He still followed orders, but he no longer trusted time to be neutral. Because he had learned something that manuals never teach. That delay isn't always caused by fear. Sometimes it's caused by discipline taken too far. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is waiting for permission that arrives too late. Years later, people would ask what the battlefield taught him. He never talked about tactics. He talked about minutes. About how quickly control dissolves when urgency is filtered through hesitation. About how systems built to prevent mistakes can sometimes create them. About how war doesn't punish recklessness first, it punishes delay. And about 90 minutes. Not because they were loud, but because they were quiet. Time moved on. It always does. The uniforms changed. The equipment evolved. New conflicts replaced old ones in briefings and headlines. For most people, the battlefield became history. Something contained in reports, documentaries, and dates. But for the junior officer, it never fully receded. Years after the operation, he still worked with radios. Not because he loved them, but because they made sense. Signals followed rules. Frequencies obeyed physics. Static had reasons. Unlike people, machines were honest about their limits. He was older now. Promoted. Respected. His voice carried authority when he spoke. Younger operators listened carefully, the way he once listened to others. They trusted the calm in his tone. They didn't know where it came from. During training exercises, he noticed things others overlooked. A half-second hesitation before a reply. A message repeated too precisely, as if someone were hiding behind procedure. A pause that felt unnecessary, but safe. Those moments caught his attention like distant alarms. He began asking questions earlier than protocol required. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough to pull clarity forward. Some superiors appreciated it, others didn't. A few reminded him that systems existed for a reason. He agreed. But he never forgot that systems also had blind spots. At night, when the world was quiet, memories returned without invitation. Not images, sounds. The way urgency fractured voices. The way silence stretched when no one wanted to be the one who pushed too hard. The way time felt elastic, slowing and speeding depending on fear and authority. He never dreamed of explosions. He dreamed of waiting. Once, years later, he visited a memorial. Names carved into stone, aligned with careful symmetry. He traced a few letters with his fingers. not knowing who they belonged to, only knowing they were connected to a timeline he carried inside him. 90 minutes. No inscription mentioned it. Life outside the military was simpler, people said, slower, less consequential. But he noticed the same patterns everywhere, in offices, in hospitals, in families. Decisions delayed because they were uncomfortable, warnings softened to avoid conflict, silence chosen to preserve order. He recognized the cost immediately. People assumed regret came from action taken too quickly. He knew better. Regret often came from action taken too late. When asked for advice by younger officers, he didn't lecture. He didn't tell war stories. He talked about listening, not just to words, but to urgency beneath them. He talked about how hesitation feels different from caution, even if they look the same on paper. He told them that waiting is still a decision, that choosing not to interrupt the chain of command doesn't remove responsibility, it only redistributes it. Some understood, some nodded politely and moved on. He expected that. Understanding usually arrives late. On the anniversary of the operation, he never marked the date publicly. No ceremonies, no posts. Just a quiet acknowledgement to himself. A reminder that time isn't neutral and silence isn't empty. He wondered sometimes what would have happened if he had spoken differently. If he had pressed harder. If he had risked being wrong instead of being late. He never let himself finish that thought. Not because it hurt, but because it changed nothing. What mattered was what came after. The way he listened now. The way he spoke sooner. The way he trusted urgency when it appeared, even if it disrupted order. The battlefield had taught him many things, but the most important lesson followed him long after the noise faded. That control is fragile. That delay can be louder than mistakes. That responsibility doesn't always sit where rank suggests. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing in any system, military or human, is the belief that there is still time. Some lessons don't arrive with force. They arrive quietly. Long after the battlefield is cleared. Long after reports are filed and ranks adjusted. Long after the world moves on. The junior officer carried his lesson not as guilt, but as awareness, a constant pressure behind every decision. He learned that waiting feels safe because it shifts responsibility. If something goes wrong, the system absorbs the blame. If something goes right, no one questions the pause. But reality doesn't care about comfort. Reality moves while permission is pending. In the 90 minutes that changed the battlefield, no rule was broken. No order was ignored. Everything happened correctly. And yet, correctness failed to protect lives. The damage came not from chaos, but from order applied too slowly. That understanding stayed with him. When he spoke now, he spoke earlier. Not louder, earlier. When urgency appeared, he treated it as information, not inconvenience. He respected structure, but he no longer worshipped it. Because he had seen what happens when systems mistake silence for stability. Years later, someone once asked him if he blamed himself. He didn't answer right away. Then he said no. Blame looks backward. Responsibility looks forward. What mattered was not rewriting those 90 minutes, but refusing to repeat them. In every decision after, he chose to shorten the space between warning and action. To question delay. To recognize that hesitation, dressed as discipline, can still be deadly. The battlefield that taught him this lesson was real, but the lesson itself was universal. In war, in leadership, in life, moments don't announce themselves as critical. They arrive disguised as pauses, as waiting, as just a few more minutes. And by the time certainty arrives, the moment is already gone. The 90 minutes didn't change history because of what happened during them. They changed it because of what didn't. No courage shown, no bold command given, only time passing unchecked. That is the quiet truth he carried forward. That silence can be a choice, that waiting is an action, and that the cost of delay is often paid by those who never had a voice in the decision. Years later, when people spoke about that operation, they spoke with distance. They said it was complicated. They said outcomes were shaped by many factors. They said hindsight made everything clearer than it ever was. All of that was true, and none of it mattered. Because clarity didn't save anyone that day. The junior officer understood something most never would. That history isn't changed only by bold moments. It is shaped just as often by the spaces between them, the pauses where nothing happens, where responsibility floats upward, where everyone waits for someone else to decide. He saw those pauses everywhere now. In meetings where warnings were softened to avoid tension. In families where truth was delayed to keep peace. In moments where action was postponed, because the cost of being wrong felt heavier than the cost of being late. He recognized the pattern instantly, and he intervened when he could. Not dramatically, not heroically, just enough to break the silence. Sometimes that meant speaking before certainty arrived. Sometimes it meant asking a question no one wanted to answer yet. Sometimes it meant accepting discomfort in exchange for momentum. Not every intervention succeeded, but fewer moments were lost to waiting. If the battlefield taught him anything final, it was this. Time does not reward patience equally. It rewards those who move when the moment is unclear. The 90 minutes were never really about war. They were about a universal illusion, that delay is neutral, that silence is harmless, that waiting keeps us safe. In truth, delay chooses a direction just as surely as action does. Most people will never sit behind a military radio. Most will never hear urgency dissolve into static. But everyone will face moments where time asks a question. Do you wait, or do you act? The junior officer never claimed to have all the answers. He only knew the cost of asking too late. And that knowledge followed him quietly, faithfully into every decision that mattered afterward. There was a moment, years later, when the question returned. Not on a battlefield, not through a radio, but quietly in an ordinary room during an ordinary decision. Someone hesitated. Someone suggested waiting. Someone said, "Let's be sure first." The words were reasonable, sensible, safe. And suddenly the junior officer, no longer junior, felt that familiar pressure, not fear, not panic, just awareness. The same awareness that had once lived inside 90 minutes. He looked around the room. No one sensed danger. No alarms rang. Nothing felt urgent enough to justify disruption. And that was exactly what made the moment dangerous. Because the most critical moments rarely feel dramatic. They feel calm. He spoke. Not forcefully. Not emotionally, just clearly, early enough to matter. He asked the question no one wanted to answer yet. He pushed the decision forward before comfort could slow it down. The outcome wasn't perfect, but it moved, and that was enough. Later, alone, he realized something that finally brought him peace. The battlefield never really leaves you, not because of trauma, but because of truth. It teaches you how time behaves under pressure, how delay disguises itself as wisdom, how silence pretends to be safety. Most people spend their lives believing they'll recognize the moment when it truly matters. They won't, because when it arrives, it will look like waiting. It will sound like patience. It will feel like restraint. It will ask for just a little more time, and time will not announce when it runs out. The junior officer had learned this the hard way, so when time asked again, quietly, politely, without urgency, he answered. The 90 minutes were never about a battlefield. They were about time, how it moves without waiting for permission. Nothing dramatic happened in those moments. No reckless charge, no heroic defiance, just silence, procedure, and patience stretched a little too far. And yet, when history looked back, it wasn't chaos that caused the loss, it was delay. The junior officer learned what many never do, that waiting feels responsible, but it still makes a choice. That silence can be safer for careers than for lives. And that by the time certainty arrives, the moment that mattered is already gone. He didn't carry guilt forward. He carried awareness. Because the real danger isn't making the wrong decision. It's believing there is always more time to make the right one. Some battles are lost in noise. Others are lost quietly while everyone is waiting. And those are the ones history rarely forgives.